here, so lucky them, right? It's a little hot out there today. And let's see, my husband is a Catholic school principal in Conway Springs. I teach online classes at Hutchinson Community College, and like Dusty said, we both graduated from the same Newman cohort. Long time ago, it seems like. Three kids ago, something like that. So I recently started with Lepanto Catholic Institute. We help parishes form disciples and form plans of discipleship, so I'm excited to start working with Lepanto. But I also stay at home with my little guy, and we have a lot of fun together. So he's very precocious. He likes to get into trouble. He knows how to open our back door now, so whew, I gotta keep an eye on him a lot. But today we're here to talk about the centuries. I really would like to cover between 1300 and 1600, but today I'm going to diverge from that quite a bit, actually, just to kind of cover some topics that I don't think got covered in Dr. Papsdorf's last class, so I'd like to make sure and cover those things. But that's kind of the time period that I'd like to cover, and it doesn't seem like a lot of time. It's only 300 years, but there's a lot that happened in those 300 years, especially church history-wise. And what I'd like you to look at real quick is I gave you something. It's a timeline of the 14th century. This is like the thing that I spent the most time creating. And I find it really helpful because I give you ecclesial history right next to secular history, so you can kind of tell what's going on in the larger world, and then also what's happening at the same time in ecclesial history. And at this time especially, there's a lot of crossover happening, right? You've got most of your monarchs of Europe, well, all of your monarchs of Europe are Catholic or Catholic in name, so there's a lot of crossover there. A few things that I just want to point out from the secular history that I won't touch on here, but things that are of note, I think, are things like we have the beginning of a little bit of going out into the world. So we have Marco Polo going out. We have Scotland becoming independent at this point in time with, William Wallace. We're all familiar with Braveheart, right? So we have him. We have the 100 Years' War between France and England beginning. We're going to touch on that again in the next 100 years because it's still going to be going on then. We have somebody that you don't hear about very often, Mansa Musa, who's the emperor of Mali in Africa, purported to be one of the most vast empires in the history of the world, and definitely one of the most rich empires in the history of the world. So that's happening. We have the beginning of the plague, and that will play into kind of the background of a lot of what's happening in this century and in our next century. And I'll touch on a few reasons for that as well. This is something I will also touch on just really briefly, but we have the conversion of Lithuania and the combination of Poland and Lithuania at this time period, and that creates kind of a Renaissance effect in Poland, which is really very beautiful. And then we have a little bit of some beginnings of Reformation rumblings. I guess we have Jan Hus in Bohemia. He's an Utrechtist, and Utrechtist is someone who says that you have to receive both the body and the blood of Jesus in order for it to be a full communion. And Hus has a couple of other things that he says, but that's one of his main tenets. And then we also have, where's he at? Well, we have William Ockham. And then we have, who's the other early reformer? I don't think I have him in here. Anyways, we have some early rumblings of the Reformation and happening already in the 13th century. But before we get started, I'd like to go ahead and pray. So if you wouldn't mind joining me in praying real quick. And I don't think it's on your slide here, so just look up here. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Creator of all things, true source of life and wisdom, origin of all being, graciously let the ray of your light penetrate the darkness of my understanding. Take from me the double darkness in which I have been born, and the obscurity of sin and ignorance. Give me a keen understanding, a retentive memory, and the ability to grasp things correctly and fundamentally. ability to express myself with thoroughness and charm. Point out the beginning, direct the progress, and help in the completion. I ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. This is the prayer of St. Thomas Aquinas before studying. So to recap a little bit, for the 13th century, so the 1200s, I kind of wanted to bring that in here because Warren Carroll, who's a favorite read of mine, he says that the 13th century is the glory of Christendom. And what he means by that is not that there was never anything wrong during those time periods, but that was a time when the Christian faith really was synthesized into culture in a fullness that hadn't happened before and didn't happen afterwards. So this is the age where we have amazing reformers. We have Francis and Clare, and we have Dominic and Thomas at that time. So there's definitely things happening in the church that need reformation. But there's a real flowering that comes out of the Dominicans and the Franciscans. We have this beautiful growing of the university system, especially the University of Paris is very prominent at this point in time. We have a flowering of religious life with these new mendicant orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. We have papal power really at its height with Innocent III. And what Innocent does is he basically says all temporal powers ought to be under the dominion, or not dominion, but underneath the authority of the Pope. And for a good 20 years or so, that actually does really happen. The history of Christendom is rife with those power struggles between temporal and the papal power there. So Innocent III, for a time, actually brings those two things together. We have the growth of scholasticism. I think you learned a lot about that with Thomas Aquinas last time. We have the age of the Crusades, so we have people rallying together to kind of go on this mission, and we're going to talk about the Crusades today. And then we also have, outside of the papacy of Innocent III, we have this struggle with the Holy Roman Emperors. So Holy Roman Emperors are unique because they purport to be the Emperor of Christendom, right? So if we have an Emperor of Christendom, then what's that relationship between the Pope and that Holy Roman Emperor? And Innocent says that the Pope ought to have the authority to help in the choosing of the emperor, and also in the coronation of the emperor, and also in some of the policies that the emperor plays out. So we really have this synthesis of faith and temporal things. And so that creates some interesting tensions in the coming century. I wanted to give you a little picture of what Europe kind of looks like in this next century that we're going to talk about, the 14th century. Because this is a Europe that is very regional. It's very specific to certain people. There's really France and England and Hungary are kind of the only countries where we see those national borders that we might be familiar with, and not even maybe all the way now today. We have a lot of kingdoms, right, especially in Germany, and we'll talk about what happens with those German principalities and kingdoms in another class. But we have over here, we have Spain, we have Castile and Aragon and Granada kind of broken up. We're going to see the synthesis of those three kingdoms in Spain coming together in the next 100 years or so. But this is what Europe looks like. And so to us, that looks like a lot of division, right? To us, that seems like, gosh, how did all these people get along? How did they work together? And they didn't for a lot of the time, but they did have one thing very much in common, and that was their faith. And what happens in the 13th century and in the 14th century is we see a lot of that common faith really bringing them together in their endeavors that they go, whether it's going abroad as far as exploration, whether it's going abroad as far as crusades, whether it's trying to figure out great problems in the church like the Avignon Papacy that we're going to talk about today. All of these little people held that common faith together. So you can see why when we get 200 years into the future, why the Reformation is going to be such a terrible thing that happens in Europe. Because even though we have all these different peoples, we have that common faith that really holds them together, and not just in name only, but also in practice, in clergy, in the running of the church, because the church is a fundamental organization within society at this time period. It is an everyday entity. It is something that anyone comes across multiple times in the day. So the church and society are very much melded together at this point in time. So I wanted to give you a picture of that so that we could kind of get an idea of what it was like to be in that time period. It's foreign to us in a lot of ways for our sensibilities, but this is the Europe that we're going to be talking about. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about, and here's what I meant by not really talking about the 13th century, is I wanted to talk about the Crusades and Islam, because I think that's an important thing for anybody who's studying church history to really wrap your mind around what happened during the Crusades. I think it's very misunderstood, and for a lot of different reasons. We think of the terrible things that happened in the Crusades, and there were terrible things that happened, but we forget sometimes, that the Crusades brought together Europe in a spiritual journey way that we have no idea kind of what that means in our day and age. So I wanted to tell you about a book that I find really, really helpful when studying church history, and I'm going to utilize it here talking about the Crusades, but it's called The Catholic Church Through the Ages. It's by John Vidmar, and I think I put it on the reading, if you want further reading kind of list for Dusty to point out to you. What I really like about John Vidmar is that he provides a really good overview of church history in a way that is easy for anybody to access. So he provides a lot of information about ideas that happened and the consequences of those ideas. I really like that a lot about John Vidmar. What John Vidmar doesn't do is he doesn't give a lot of dates and names and kind of historical information that's very specific and minute sometimes. So if you're looking for that, John Vidmar is probably a good place to begin, but not a great way.
What is the last name?
Vidmar, V-I-D-M-A-R. Yeah, and I like the second edition a little bit better than the first edition. So if you're looking for somebody who gets into the minute details and tells you everybody's name and the year that it happened, then I would recommend Warren Carroll. He has a 5-volume history of Christendom that I really enjoy. I don't always agree with everything that Carroll says, but often I do. I find that he gives a pretty good detailed exhibition of what happens. His emphasis is on the papacy, which is a really interesting. You don't find many history books that follow the papacy the way that Warren Carroll does.
What's the title on that one?
This one is called The Cleaving of Christendom. Yeah, and volume 3 is called The Glory of Christendom, and that probably covers this time period a little bit better.
We've got the set in the library upstairs if anyone wants to
that's great.
take a look.
Awesome. Yeah, I would recommend, picking him up for sure if you're really looking for a lot of detail. So, but I do want to talk about the Crusades because this is an important thing to discuss. So the Crusades really are before the 13th century. They start in the year 1096, and then they're over kind of formally by the year 1270, but there's a little bit of carrying on into the later centuries, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the Crusades are an interesting time. They started out with Pope Urban the VIII, I believe. Yeah, Pope Urban II. I was way off there. So Urban II called the First Crusade in the year 1095. People didn't leave and get there until about 1096. So he calls this First Crusade, and the reason he calls it at the Council of Clermont is because of things that have been happening in the Holy Land. So the Crusades are really about defending and reclaiming the Holy Land in the best sense. Okay, so that's like their lofty goal, is to reclaim the Holy Land so that, not necessarily to have Christian kingdoms there, but so that pilgrims can go there, and so that the Christians of the Middle East can live there in peace, basically. That's their goal. Now, what really happens is a very different story sometimes. But Pope Urban II called it, and one of the reasons that they called it, besides regaining Jerusalem, is because of the encroachment of Islam into that area, into Jerusalem, but also into Spain. So if you're familiar with what happens in Spain, the Crusades in Spain have kind of already been happening for a couple hundred years by this point in time. And they call this not a crusade, but they call it the Reconquista, because what's happened in Spain is that Muslims have made inroads up and up and up further north into Spain through, that there's a Strait of Gibraltar and it's really close to North Africa. So it's very easy for them to get into Spain. So the Spanish have been trying to fight the Muslims back for 800 years. And they will until about the year 1492, which is why that's a really important year in Christendom, not only because Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but also for a lot of other reasons too. So Urban II calls the First Crusade, and he calls it to send crusaders out to reconquer Jerusalem. So what happens is they're led primarily by some Christian kings. Bohemond is the big one in the First Crusade. And it's interesting because there's this kind of unity, but then it kind of breaks apart between the Western Church, the Latin Church, and then the Eastern Church down in Constantinople. So they both want to keep the Muslims out of Christian territory, but they don't work very well together doing that. So the Crusaders come out of Europe and they go down to Constantinople, which is kind of, I wish I had a map here, but it's kind of at the tip of the European continent, and then after you cross Constantinople, you come into kind of the Middle East. So they come into Constantinople. The leader of Constantinople doesn't know what to do with them, so because he's afraid that they're going to attack Constantinople. So he hurries them on and doesn't really give them supplies or anything. So that's kind of, conflict number one. But eventually the Crusaders come and they take the fortified city of Nicaea. Nicaea is really important because it's kind of the next stop after Constantinople in like the guarding of Christian territory. So they have Nicaea, and they take Nicaea because the Turks who are occupying it actually aren't there. So they take Nicaea pretty easily. But then they get into Antioch, which is another fortified Christian city, or used to be a fortified Christian city. It has now been taken over by Muslim Turks. And so they come into Antioch. They're actually beaten in Antioch, but they make it out and they siege and pillage the city of Jerusalem. Now the First Crusade is kind of where Crusades get a notorious reputation, because what happens is the Crusaders go nuts in Jerusalem. And they are totally indiscriminate. They're fighting, civilians, non-combatants. They're, raping, they're pillaging. They're doing really terrible things in the city of Jerusalem. Warren Carroll gives a pretty good, pretty honest assessment of what happened. Basically, he just says, they lost control because they were so excited about being in Jerusalem. He doesn't explain it away or anything, but he just says that's what he thinks happens. So, but they do take Jerusalem. The First Crusade is also well known because it's the only successful crusade. So they take Jerusalem, they set up some princes there to guard Jerusalem. Now, part of the problem with the Crusades is that it's this spiritual thing, right? it's not a military thing. It's really a spiritual thing. It's really about defending the faith. It's really about defending, the holy places. And so while there's that fervor there to do that, there's not a whole lot of desire to stay and see it through as far as guarding these places and, establishing protections around it. So they leave a couple of guys there, but everybody else pretty much goes back. So what's going to happen after that? The Turks are going to come back in again, right? So they take Jerusalem, they set up a couple of guys there, and they're all like, see you later. Bohemond goes back, and then Jerusalem gets taken again. So that's what happens. So the Second Crusade happens. I'm not going to be able to talk about all the Crusades because there's a lot of them. The Second Crusade happens. That's a failure. They try to, I think that one's more about retaking Antioch and Nicaea. The Third Crusade is probably the most famous crusade because it's got the most famous leaders of the Crusades. We've got Philip II in France, who was married to Eleanor of Aquitaine, if that name means anything to anybody. She actually goes on the crusade with them, which causes some problems. So they go, let's see, we've got Richard the Lionhearted from England, and we've got Frederick Barbarossa from the Holy Roman Empire. Now, Frederick Barbarossa is 7 years old when he goes on this crusade, and he actually dies before they actually get here, which is unfortunate because he was probably their best leader, honestly. So the Third Crusade is all about recapturing Jerusalem again. Again, there's kind of this beautiful unity that happens, England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, the three kind of most powerful kingdoms in Europe have set down their differences, essentially, not in everyday life, unfortunately, but there is a lot of squabbling, but they set down their differences, they bring their people together, and they go to reconquer Jerusalem. Unfortunately, what happens is that they die. The Crusaders end up experiencing a lot of disease when they siege the Jerusalem, and so a lot of their people die off because of sickness. And they're also up against probably one of the most famous and best leaders, military leaders of the Turkish Empire, who is Saladin. If you know Saladin, right, he's pretty famous. So he's the one that Francis of Assisi goes down and tries to visit and tries to convert. So it's very interesting. You've got these amazing kind of convergence of all of these really impressive figures at the Third Crusade. But suffice it to say, the Third Crusade is also unsuccessful. Let's see if I can give you a little bit better picture of that. What they did capture is, if you're familiar with Monty Python, is Acre, right? So they capture Acre, which is right outside of Jerusalem, but they're not able to capture the city of Jerusalem. So what the Third Crusade does is they set up a Christian principality in Acre, and then several other smaller Christian principalities in that area as well. So they leave those people there. Those leaders come back to Europe. Richard the Lionhearted gets captured, and there's all of that fiasco with him. But ultimately, really, the Third Crusade is a failure. They do not capture Jerusalem. A lot of the Crusaders die. Frederick Barbarossa dies, so they have to elect a new Holy Roman Emperor. And this is the pattern that the Crusades go on, okay? So I wanted to touch on the People's Crusade because that's a really interesting, I think it's a really interesting insight into this fervor that came out of the Crusades. The People's Crusade actually kind of happens about the same time as the First Crusade, so around 1096, 1100. And it started by Peter the Hermit. Peter the Hermit preaches the crusade. So one of the things that happens when the popes call a crusade is that it's preached in these different areas. They send out, preachers and kind of evangelists to say, come and support the crusade. You can You can have an indulgence from the crusade. You know, you can have these things forgiven of you if you complete the crusade or die at the crusade. So a lot of men go to the crusade in order to, you know, have this indulgence fulfilled. They also are asking for money for the crusade. So Peter the Hermit is one of these preachers that goes out, and he really stirs up this popular uprising. But the people that Peter the Hermit calls are just kind of your everyday normal people. There are very few people who are trained militarily in Peter the Hermit's People's Crusade. So he takes, it's a ton of people, 40,000 people? Something like that, 40,000 people, and maybe a tenth of them are militarily trained. And so they come down, the Emperor of Constantinople tries to get them to move on again. They meet the Turks, it doesn't say where, but they meet the Turks once they're out of Constantinople, and basically they're slaughtered and taken into slavery. I think only like 2,000 or 3,000 people from the actual People's Crusade actually ever returned to Europe at the time. So it's a really interesting combination of like that religious fervor that gets people excited, but maybe it wasn't thought out the best. So, and that happens. There's also the Children's Crusade, and that kind of, I would say, gets repeated a little bit with the Children's Crusade. So I wanted to talk about the end of the Crusades. So the Eighth Crusade ends in 1270. The leader of the Eighth Crusade is King of St. Louis IX, who's the famous king of France, the only sainted king of France. And he is the one who leads the Eighth Crusade, and it also fails. They try to recapture Jerusalem. It ends up kind of fizzling out. The Seventh Crusade is the sacking of Constantinople, and this creates a real rift with the people of the East and kind of drives them further apart. So if you remember from your history, in the year 1054, that's the official division between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. There's that division, and so, you know, we're only talking, 40 or 50 years from the beginning of the Crusade, so there's a lot of ill feelings there already, and then we have the sacking of Constantinople. 1291, Acre falls, and that's really when anyone who was left over in those Christian principalities also leaves that area completely. And that was probably the end of what we would still call like the formal Crusades. However, we have this continued kind of clash between the Turkish forces, the Islamic forces that continues to happen on. Constantinople falls in the year 1453, and that's because of the invasion of the Turks. And unfortunately, not very many Western forces come to help Constantinople at all. Probably could have been stopped if there was some help. We have Lepanto, which is that famous sea battle in 1571. If you're familiar with G.K. Chesterton, he writes the famous, Battle of Lepanto. I might assign that for reading for our next class, so, or part of it at least. We have the fall of Vienna. There's this huge battle, not fall of Vienna, but we have the Battle of Vienna in 1683. In 1683, that kind of ends the invasion attempts of the Turkish Empire and the Ottoman Empire into what we call Western Europe. So there's still a lot of Eastern European things that are happening, but they don't try to come into Italy or those other countries in Western Europe after that. So it's interesting to kind of figure out like what were the good things about the Crusades and what went wrong with the Crusades. And I think Vidmar does a really good job of kind of seeing both sides of it, because he says, really, the Crusades don't make sense unless you understand them from a spiritual viewpoint. All the attempts to view the Crusades as these like military campaigns or this, aggression between Christians to Islams really fall short, he says, because the emphasis and the beginning and the fervor that drives these people on is really a spiritual fervor. Now, definitely it was misplaced and definitely it was misused, but in its essence, it's really a spiritual desire to see the holy places and to see the Holy Land as a place that is available for Christians to go to. So that in and of itself is not a bad thing. However, Vidmar says, that spiritual fervor is both, a boon to it, but also detracts from it because it doesn't allow for those crusaders to really think in the long term. Like, okay, what's going to happen when we take Jerusalem? They didn't really think that out, which sounds crazy to us. What are we going to do when we get to Jerusalem? Well, we're going to kill all the Muslims so that they can, all the Christians can come in. Well, how are we going to sustain our presence there? I don't know. So they didn't really think about those things. And it really wasn't about like military gain. It wasn't about, we're going to take these lands because, they're important port cities or they're, we want to extend the Christian empire. It was really fundamentally about regaining lands so that Christians could be in those lands. So another thing that the Crusades accomplished that I feel like is a good thing is that it kept the Muslims from invading Europe for really 200 years. We have the Reconquista that's happening in Spain is keeping the Muslims from coming up into Europe in that way. But also, we didn't have this aggressive kind of going out of the Crusaders down into Asia Minor, then it was very likely that the Turkish forces would have made their way up into Europe quite a bit earlier than they ever did. We heard 1453 is the fall of Constantinople. That's quite a bit further down the line from the 11th and 12th century that this is happening in. Another thing that the Crusades really did well was that it spurred on and kept alive that sense of Christian unity. We kind of talked about that Christian unity that was happening in the 12th century with Francis of Assisi and Dominic and Thomas. But the Crusades was really another aspect of that unity. I can't think of very many other examples from history where different people from different countries come together to fight an aggressor, aside from the 2 world wars. It's very uncharacteristic of the way that humanity works for many people from many different lands to find something that they are so unified on that they will go out and fight for that cause. And so that's really what the Crusades did. It really helped continue that sense of Christian unity within Europe for 200 years. So the failures of the Crusades, I really feel like it's good for us to know not only what was good and beautiful about the Crusades, but also what was wrong with the Crusades, because we have to be honest with our history. And so there was that lack of commitment in keeping Jerusalem. That was a big problem. We have these leaders who, some of them are really too big for their britches. So, sorry, my husband's trying to call me. They're really too big for their britches and they lack unity. And there's also that lack of unity with the Eastern leaders. The Crusades could have gone very differently if there had been a better dealing with Constantinople. If the Crusaders hadn't been so aggressive against them, if the Greeks and the leaders of Constantinople had not felt so defensive for their own things, there really could have been a real flowering and a real unity there, and maybe it could have even brought back, that the East and the West together, but that did not happen. It actually drove Eastern and Western Christians further and further apart. We have the failure, really, of the Crusaders to incorporate themselves into Middle Eastern society. So what I mean by that, yeah.
Well, you said that there was a lack of unity between the East and the West, but didn't the church leaders in Constantinople also realize that the Muslims were trying to encroach upon the Holy Lands? I mean,
Definitely.
did they need convincing, or should they have known about it and just rallied to the cause with the Western Church?
Well, they probably should have, honestly. Constantinople, there's just so much happening in Constantinople that it was almost like they couldn't look outside their own city because of all the internal rife that was happening in the city of Constantinople. So I would say that's probably the most simple answer. There were Orthodox, well, not Orthodox, but Greek Orthodox that were coming and aiding and fighting with the Crusaders, but they were not fighting, they were not coming together as one unified force. They were like, okay, well, you know, you guys go on, and then 6 months later we'll bring in our forces right behind. Well, there's no power in that, right? It's only powerful if you have all of these forces together, and they did not have that unity. They had that kind of distrust and misunderstanding between them that they couldn't even rally their forces to fight together. So, but yeah, that's a really good point. So, yeah. You know, we know as Americans, you know, we have all of these conflicts that we can learn about, but, you know, part of coming into a new land is incorporating yourself and getting to know the people that were there. The Crusaders did none of that, right? Their focus was on fighting and regaining and not anything about learning to get along with the people that were already there. So basically, for the people who were already there, even the Christians who were already there, it was, you know, trading one overlord for another overlord. So there was no real freedom that came with the Crusaders coming in here, even for the Middle Eastern Christians that lived in those lands. So that was a big problem too, you know, for them to learn how to incorporate themselves better. And so that was a failure of the Crusades. So overall, I would say the impact of the Crusades is kind of a mixed bag. We have the further disunity with Constantinople, but we have things like the ideas of chivalry. And I think this is a really interesting thing because we don't have those chivalry concepts coming in until the Crusaders start coming back. And part of the reason is that for all of their, you know, trying to fight the Turks, they did come away with a few ideas from them in that in the East, not only in Constantinople, but also the Muslim forces themselves, women had a higher role. They were more part of the decision-making factors. Now, not anywhere near, you know, where we might be with modern day, but it did bring those ideals up into Europe. And so you can see in the 13th century, there are some pretty powerful women saints that come about really because they have been given a voice a little bit. And so we have people like Jadwiga in Poland, who is kind of the first monarch that was a woman who really brought about some amazing things. We have Gertrude the Great, we have Catherine of Siena. All of these ladies are kind of given a voice through this idea of chivalry. And we also have the devotion to the Rosary that St. Dominic, remember, received kind of the devotion of the Rosary, but it wasn't until the Crusaders brought that devotion with them as a way to kind of move forward and continue to pray that the devotion spread throughout, besides that little provincial area that Dominic was in. So these are some of the impacts, I would say, on Christendom. I don't know that the Crusades really had a huge impact on secular history. I mean, aside from kind of not having the Turks invade further up into Europe. But, so I would say that's probably my assessment of the Crusades. I don't know if anybody has anything to add or to ask about that. Yeah.
When you use the term Turks, are you literally talking about people from Turkey or just Muslims?
I'm talking about Turkish Muslims. So that's what they called themselves at that time period. Because yeah, that Turkish Empire was pretty big. They had expanded into a lot of areas. That's a good question though, because we have a lot of different types of Muslims, just like there are a lot of different types of Christians. So the Turks were probably the biggest foe of the Crusaders, because that's the lands that they were trying to get into.
The Muslim faith right now has, you know, fight between the Sunnis and the Shiite.
Right.
Did that exist back then?
There was, yeah, there was that division. Part of it was military division more than faith division, but there was, that started all the way at the very beginning of the Muslim faith, really.
But it wasn't enough to break up your unity to fight Christians.
Well, no, that was actually part of the reason that the First Crusade was successful, was because the Turkish Muslims were fighting, I can't remember who, another Muslim sect. So they had left Nicaea and kind of opened themselves to be able to let the Crusaders continue on. But yeah, I mean, there was a lot of infighting between the different Muslim, the Ottomans and the Turks, and different leaders turning over. Lots of power struggles that I just don't have time to get into.
Did the Black Plague affect the whole world as Europe?
It did, yeah. So the Crusades is before the plague happens. So the Crusades ends in 1270. The plague doesn't hit until the middle of the 1300s. So yeah.
It hit the Muslim population.
It does hit the Muslim population too, yes. Not as hard as Europe though.
You mentioned something about the Muslims just vaguely being in Eastern Europe, because I know that they were, it wasn't called Serbia back then, but parts of Yugoslavia. So how much into Eastern Europe did they, get into and influence and take over?
Right, well, so we have the sacking of Constantinople in 1454, and that kind of is the floodgate that opens letting, I think it's Ottoman Turks come into Eastern Europe and come into those areas. So then after that, you have Bohemia, parts of Hungary, a lot of what we call Serbia and Yugoslavia today getting continual onslaughts. So those areas actually kind of get gradually more converted into being more prominently Muslim.
In fact, the Bosnian War was probably a modern day ghost of that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, we call it by different names now, but a lot of those conflicts are just residual things that carry over through the centuries. So, yeah. Good question. So yeah.
Jackie, can you give us just 2 or 3 sentences on the Knights Templar?
The Knights Templar. I can. So the Knights Templar is a religious order that is a military religious order. And so, we don't think like that anymore, right? We don't think about monks with swords at all. But they were. We have the Knights Templar, we have the St. John, the Hospitallers. And so they are a religious order. I can't remember which crusade they came down with. They came down with those crusaders and were established in Jerusalem. And one of their jobs was to protect like the holy places. So like the sepulcher, probably Nazareth, those Bethlehem, like those areas, they were established to protect the holy places.
The reason I'm asking is they play such a big part in Ivanhoe and even Indiana Jones. I mean, I really, I was just asking what your version.
Yeah, sure, yeah. I mean, they're a military religious order, so it's so far out of our scope of understanding that it's hard for us to understand that. And so I think that's why it gets maybe demonized a little bit, so.
Mm-hmm.
I've even seen online, there's like people that are trying to rekindle the Knights Templar and trying to adopt their philosophy. It's very interesting, but
That is interesting.
they do, some cultures and groups tend to demonize the Knights Templar, and then there's some of those that really lift it up as being a model, to embrace today, especially with all the trouble that's going on in Europe now. So do you have any, comment or thoughts on that, or?
That's a tricky question. I would say.
How were they demonized? In what
Well,
way?
because people would say, well, that's the Christian faith, and doesn't the Christian faith teach peace and love your enemies? So why are these, people that have consecrated their life to God, why are they killing their enemies instead of treating them, with the principles of the Christian faith? So, yeah, so I mean, I would say that's how they're demonized. So, the same could be said for a lot of things that happened in the Middle Ages. And I think this gets a little bit into, well, what is the role of Christianity with other faiths? So, like some people say, well, why didn't, the Christians try to convert the Muslims? Well, that's a very different thing than what we're used to today, you know, like we would never force anyone to become Christian or never kill anyone because they weren't Christian. But in the Middle Ages, we have this idea of, well, they're infringing on our people, they're killing our people, they're, you know, invading our territory. So it's a different thing, you know, when you have someone fighting you, trying to take your land, trying to take your wife and your children, or, killing you because you are not their faith, you know, then, you know, there's that dynamic of, well, what's a just war and what's not a just war. So, you know, it's hard for modern people to understand, but I think that if we kind of view it in that way, you know, as, well, you know, this was an aggressor, so what is our role, you know, as far as, you know, is this a just war, is this not a just war? Should we just, you know, let this happen, or should we try other means before fighting? So I think it's a little bit trickier than we give it credit for. So, and I think that, you know, just war theory has developed over time too. So I don't know if that, I don't think that really answers your question, but.
But who was the aggressor in this part? Taking over the whole lands. Who was the actual aggressor?
It was an act of aggression, I would agree.
By who? Muslim?
The Muslim Turks, yeah, because these were originally Christian lands, right? So there's, you know, but then there's that whole, well, they've been there for hundreds of years, so, you know, when does, you know, a person that's come in and invaded a land and established themselves there, when does that get turned around as, well, now you're invading us, and we've been here for hundreds of years. So part of the Crusade was also spurred by aggression happening specifically against Christians in the Holy Land, pilgrims and Christians who were living there in Jerusalem and in the surrounding areas. So that's part of the problem. So I think that that's all the time I can give the Crusades though today, but we can definitely, if you have more questions, I'd be happy to talk about it. But the next thing I want to talk about is another fun thing in Christian history. I wanted to talk about the Avignon Papacy. So this is actually in the 13th century. Now remember I said back at the beginning we have kind of the heights of papal power with Pope Innocent III. And that's in the middle of the 12th century, or in the middle of the 13th century, so the middle of the 1200s. After we have Innocent III, we have kind of a decline of the power of the papacy. One of the popes abdicates his papal power because he is so distraught at the way that it's being handled. So he's the only pope that's ever abdicated his papacy, not resigned. We have Benedict the 16th now, and that's a little bit different. So we have this interesting man, Pope Boniface VIII, who comes in at the beginning of the 1300s. And Boniface VIII tries to reestablish the papacy and the power of the papacy that Innocent III had. And he tries to tell all of the Christian kings and leaders that you are under my authority, and all of your people are under my authority. He writes a papal bull called Unum Sanctum that basically says everyone in the whole world has to be under the power of the papacy in order for them to be saved. So that's some pretty strong words. So Boniface VIII kind of tries to assert himself, and he gets basically kind of kicked out of Rome. Let me make sure I'm getting all my details correct here. Yeah, so he gets kicked out of Rome, and then dies fairly shortly after. And then we have Blessed Benedict the 11th. And he is a lot more timid than Boniface, but basically what happens with Benedict is that the people of Rome and the cardinals dislike him so much that a mob attacks him, and he dies from the injuries of this attack days later afterwards. So that's part of the reason he's Blessed Benedict the 11th. And the cardinals come together and they elect Pope Clement V. Now the problem that happens is that Clement V is dominated and protected expressly by the French clergy. He's a Frenchman himself. The Romans do not like having a French pope in the papacy at all. And so Clement V is a fairly weak pope, and he decides for his protection and for his safety to move the papal courts to the city of Avignon in France. Now the problem with this is several things. Number one, first and foremost, the Bishop of Rome is not living in his see. Now this has become a continued problem in the church. Bishops not living in the place that they're the bishop of. Now to us, we're just like, why would they not live there? But it was more about prestige and power. You know, oh, well, I'm the bishop of, you know, Venice, but, you know, he doesn't actually live there. Well, how can a bishop rule very well and know the problems of his people if he's not living there? So that's problem number one. He's not living in his see. We also have the problem that Clement V and the subsequent popes that live in Avignon are not independent entities. So they are ruled fairly heavily by the French court and by the whims of the French court, and also by kind of financial and military assistance. So, you know, well, we'll give you assistance financially, we'll give you, you know, protection, but you've got to, you know, speak for French interests as the Pope. So many people didn't like that. So obviously, this is going to become a big problem for the church. The popes of Avignon, some of them were not terrible people, but they did not move the papacy back to Rome where they should have. Now Rome is a hot mess basically at this time, but that doesn't give them the right not to, you know, try to move the papacy back there. There are some reforms that happen in the Curia at this time, and there were some attempts at returning, but they were very feeble attempts. They'd be like, oh, okay, we're going to go to Rome, and oh, never mind, the weather's not right. We're going to go back to Avignon, you know. Oh, we're going to, okay, oh, now we really are going to try to go to Rome. Okay, oh, no, there's just too many mean people in Rome. So, okay, we're going to go back to Avignon. Finally, Gregory XI returns really at the insistence and the persuasion of Catherine of Siena. So we have a picture here of Catherine of Siena, you know, really pleading with the Holy Father, you know, we need you to be our Holy Father in Rome, and this is a scandal to the church that this is happening. So Gregory XI returns to Rome, but he dies fairly soon afterwards. And what happens is that people are freaking out that either the papacy is going to be returned to Rome, or returned to Avignon, that's what the Italian cardinals are worried about. The French cardinals are worried that they are losing all of their power. And so, and put on top of this, we have the Roman people who are very attached to the papacy being in Rome. And so they are like with torches and pitchforks and you know, pounding on the doors of the conclave to elect a Roman pope or an Italian pope. They do not want anyone who is French in the papacy again. And so, lots of stress, but the cardinals elect Pope Urban VI. Now, they elect Pope Urban VI and they actually don't put Urban VI. You know how when Pope Francis was elected, he came up onto the little stage and everybody clapped and cheered and we saw him for the first time. Urban VI is so scared that they put like a pretend pope up there, basically, because they're afraid that the Roman mob has been stirred into this frenzy so much that they're going to you know, mistake him for a Frenchman and they're going to kill him up there. So they put a pretend guy up there, but he really is the Pope. Pope Urban VI becomes the Pope. However, after this happens, after Urban is Pope for a while, maybe, you know, a couple of weeks or a month, a faction of the cardinals comes and they say, this is not a valid conclave and election of the Pope because we were under duress from that Roman mob. And we're going to come and we're going to elect a new Pope. We're saying that this whole thing was invalid and we're going to elect our own Pope. Now this is not all the cardinals. This is not with Urban VI. He is not saying this. He does not support this. So this group of cardinals comes and they elect a new Pope, Clement VII. And where does he go? Back to Avignon. Okay, so they elect a French pope, anti-pope. We're going to call him an anti-pope. And they go back to France. Okay, so now we have a pope in France, in Avignon. We have a pope in Rome. Okay, now this becomes what we call the Great Western Schism. Okay, it is a fact. And what happens is that this becomes such a long, drawn-out thing that even good people have no idea what to do with this information. They don't know who the right pope is. So we have basically kind of lines drawn along national lines. So if you're French, then you support Clement the Seventh. If you're Italian, or if you are from the Holy Roman Empire, you support Urban V. And so then we have these popes, and these popes die. And these groups elect a new successor for each of these popes. So instead of having an opportunity to say, you know, all right, we got to do the right thing here, when they die, they don't. They continue on the schism. This is a terrible scandal for the church. Because people don't know what to think. We even have good saints who are split along these different lines. So Catherine of Siena supports the Roman Pope, Pope Urban V, and then Boniface IX. But we have St. Vincent Ferrer, who's in France, who he supports Clement VII, and Benedict the 13th, who gets elected afterwards. So this is a really big problem. And so some of the cardinals come and they try to solve this problem. Unfortunately, they try to solve the problem in the worst way possible by not getting the approval of the popes from the anti-popes from Avignon and the Roman popes. They just decide that groups of cardinals are going to come together and they're going to elect a new pope in the city of Pisa. And that pope is Alexander V. So Alexander V gets elected in Pisa by a group of cardinals, some from Rome, some from Avignon, but without the approval of either of the popes. And so none of these men will step down. So we're here now about about 1410. So we've got John the 23rd, okay? So that name should sound familiar. We have a real Pope John the 23rd, right? We have Gregory the 12th. We have Benedict the 13th, okay, at this point in time. This is just a huge, terrible problem. And the successors will not step down. So things finally reach such a fever pitch that the Holy Roman Emperor, Sigismund, calls the Council of Constance in 1415, okay? Now, other councils have been called before. Pisa is not an official church council because it was not called by the Roman Pope at this time, so it is an invalid council. Constance, in 1415, is a valid council because it was affirmed by the Roman Pope, Pope Gregory the 12th, at the time, okay? So that's one way you can judge whether a council is a real council or not. So we have, finally, Gregory the 12th, for the good of the church, after affirming that the Council of Constance is indeed a real council, he steps down for the good of the church. Pope John the 23rd, 23rd, I should have wrote 23rd, is deposed by some of the guys who elected him, and he flees away, and for a while he pretends he's still the Pope, but then eventually he's reconciled, okay? Pope Clement VIII, who is the Avignon Pope, decides to run away to Spain, and he tries to kind of set up his dominion there in Spain. And he continues on until, 1429? As a Spanish claimant of the papacy. So, but nobody's really following him anymore. So, together at the Council of Constance, after Gregory has stepped down, after John the 23rd is deposed, the cardinals reach a decision and elect a new pope who is Martin V. And this finally ends this problem. But notice the dates here. We have 1415 is the end, and we started this in 1378. So that is a really long time to not know who's pope, right? we've had periods in the church before where there have been like 2 years where the cardinals couldn't get along and couldn't decide a pope. Now that's a problem, but this is a big problem. And this, unfortunately, you know, is one of the things that the reformers discuss. You know, we have these national cardinals who are after their own interests and not the interests of the greater church, okay? So I really feel like the Avignon Papacy is, and the Council of Constance and the Western Schism, this is something that leads to the falling of the church. Because it results in a loss of prestige for the papacy. Before, even though the popes were really powerful and had a lot of sway over temporal things, everyone agreed who the pope was. Everyone could look to the pope as the head of the church. But this confused so many people that people felt like they could not trust the papacy anymore. This caused scandal, it caused division even between good, holy people, saints, and it also resulted in the problem of Conciliar Ism. Conciliar Ism is the idea that councils have more power than the Pope does, okay? So a council comes before a Pope, and basically that councils can be called by the bishops and by the cardinals without the approval of the Pope. That's what happened at Pisa, right? So conciliarism is actually, it can be a problem in the church, and it's kind of a pervasive problem that underlies several things, but this happens at Constance, it's a problem. There's a few more councils that conciliarism is really an issue. Okay, we have Constance, the Council of Basel in 1413, and then we have the Council of Florence, and all of these councils are all dealing with this issue of conciliarism. So we're not going to touch on those, but it is a pervasive problem that happens. And actually comes back up in the church, you know, every 100 years or so, it will kind of pop back up again. Yeah.
Could you go again, explain again conciliarism, exactly the definition that you're referring to in this?
Yeah, sure. Conciliarism, let me give you what Vidmar says here. A council is prior to any pope. A council is prior to any pope. So councils can be called by the College of Cardinals and the bishops without the approval of the pope.
But aren't you talking about power in policy and procedure, not religious dogma, right?
Well, both, because sometimes councils are called for both reasons. So, but they're saying conciliarism, which is a heresy, says that you don't need the approval of the Pope in order to call a council. And that is in direct conflict with really the history of councils up until the Council of Pisa. So all of the councils that we consider valid councils have all been done so at either the direct intervention of the Pope or at least him giving his blessing to the council even if he's not there.
So what dogma has councils passed? What?
Right,
Yeah,
so
conception.
if a council that's called by just the cardinals and just the bishops, but does not have the approval of the Pope, then that would be considered an invalid council, and the dogma that was talked about or discussed there would not be considered in accord with church teaching necessarily. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we have to, you know, it's really interesting because this is really early, right, to be dealing with these democratic principles, but it's happening within the church, at the highest levels of the church it's happening. So I'm not saying democracy is bad, I'm just saying that the church is not a democracy, so, yeah.
And looking at all that, I mean, it's no wonder that, like you mentioned, the Reformation started, the early stirrings of it, because that's just, I'm sitting here almost embarrassed, and oh my gosh.
Yeah.
What does that have to do with my faith?
Right,
They
right.
totally left the Holy Spirit out of this whole thing.
It's true, it's true.
It's disturbing, yeah, very disturbing.
It is disturbing.
I was gonna say, we see echoes of it now,
Right, we do, and that's really true. When I was reading about this and researching, I was just like, gosh, this is hard, this is hard because it reminds us of things that happen today. So I would just say, that, Saint Vincent Ferrar, who followed the anti-pope, is still a saint in our church. So, you know, I mean, you can be holy even if, you know, you are misinformed, okay? Or you can be holy, you know, even despite these circumstances where, you know, we don't know who to follow or who's the rightful leader. So sanctity is possible at any time in the church. Sometimes it's just harder than other times.
I think the core is following Christ. He was the
Right,
one who formed the church.
right.
We are for him. We are not there for this priest, for this person, for the other. We are there.
That's right, exactly. We have to, yeah, we return to Christ because he's where our hope lies, so.
I think studying the history gives you more return to that.
It does, because it doesn't seem like life is such a terrible tragedy when things go wrong, because you realize, gosh, you know, we've been through things, terrible things in our church, and there are still holy men in time.
All the time.
It's true,
In the Dark Ages was no different.
that's right,
No different.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
this doesn't affect apostolic tradition, I mean, it still goes through the bishops, really, not through the Pope anyway.
Shows that the church is both a human and divine entity.
Tell me, say that again real quick.
Apostolic tradition, it goes through the bishops anyway, doesn't really go through the Pope, is that?
Well, I mean, the bishops receive their
From the bishops.
bishop from the apostles, right? But the line of Peter is a straight line. So let me go back here to this one. So we have here, I did this little diagram down here. So we have pink is Avignon, blue is Rome. Here's Pisa over here. So where do we take the line that comes from Peter at? We take it from Rome. Okay, so we go through Rome. So these guys and these guys are considered anti-popes. Okay, some of them were good men. I'm not saying they weren't good men. Pretty arrogant, I would say, but good men could be. Okay, but that doesn't change the fact that the line of the papacy comes through the line of Peter. Okay, so again, you know, we know this from the history of the church. There have been a lot of popes who were not very good men, but the line of Peter still continues through them, okay? So we do have apostolic tradition continued on through this messy period, through the bishops of Rome, through the papacy in Rome, so. Yeah.
Another thing to think about, kind of pertinent to Gabriel's question, is that, and see if you would agree with this, that there's plenty of times in church history that a straw poll of bishops would have voted to support a heresy, perhaps. I'm thinking of Arianism, for example,
Right.
where the council of bishops would not have safeguarded doctrine at that point. But luckily, the vicar of Christ, Peter, would. And so, yeah, that's kind of one of those modern questions. It goes all the way back to Conciliar Ism. I think that there's some people that are of the opinion that it's really all the bishops together, what they agree on, which is safeguarded, but that's not really the case. It's the bishops, as you said, the bishops in line with the Pope.
Right, exactly, right.
Mhm.
And that's why we say that councils are inspired by the Holy Spirit. Now that doesn't mean bad things can't happen at councils, because John Hus was burned at the stake at a council, so that's a problem. So, however, the dogma that happened at the council was in keeping with the teachings of the church. So, so yeah, I mean, you know, I think it's so good to not be scandalized by our history, in the sense that we don't have our own personal faith shaken. Like, it's okay to say, you know, that was a terrible time in church history, and you know, but I still believe, you know. I think if you look at it, and that's why I like church history. If you look at it, you know, you could say, gosh, you know, the faith has endured through so much. So yeah, so I wanted to touch here real briefly, because I don't want to run over time, on the saints of the 14th century. And remember, I talked about how I thought chivalry kind of led to this great stirring of female saints. So here are some of the female saints of the church. We have Gertrude the Great, who was an amazing mystic, who had a lot of influence through her spiritual writings in the church. We have Saint Elizabeth of Portugal, who was the great niece, I think, of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, who is a Catholic monarch who has a lot of influence, and she actually prevents a civil war from happening in between Spain and Portugal at the time because her husband was unfaithful and he had children with her, but also children who were considered illegitimate. So she prevents a civil war from happening. I said Spain, but I meant Portugal. We have Saint Bridget of Sweden, who is another amazing mystical saint. She tries to influence Sweden and continue the Catholic faith on in Sweden, even when the rumblings of Reformation and that starts to happen. And then we have one of my favorite saints, who is Jadwiga. Sometimes she's called Hedwig, of Poland. And she was the heir to the Polish throne, the only female heir to the Polish throne that had ever happened until then. And she married Jagiello, I'm not good with my Polish, I'll be honest. And he was the king of Lithuania. Pagan king at the time. He converts and he brings the whole Lithuanian country together to the faith. And they combine their kingdoms, and we get the beautiful flowering of the Catholic faith in Poland. We have this amazing Renaissance kind of flowering of culture that happens, especially in the city of Krakow at this time. So Jadwiga is really beautiful. And then we have St. Peregrine and St. Rocco, who are both I kind of get them confused because their statues look a lot alike. But Peregrine, who actually was a rebel, he followed, let me make sure I get this story right. Oh yeah, he was a member of an anti-papal party, but then he met St. Philip Benizi, who kind of turned him on the right path, so sometimes he's called the rebel who became a saint. He's also the patron saint of those who suffer from cancer, because he had cancer on his foot and it was miraculously cured. And then we have St. Rocco, who was an aide to plague victims. And so, yeah, St. John Nepomucene, who is the patron of Czechoslovakia, he's the one who was martyred because he would not tell something that the king had said in the confessional, and so he was martyred because of that. So,
What was Gertrude the Great from?
Gertrude the Great was from, let me double check. I don't remember. I think she was French, but I'm not positive. Or Belgian, maybe Belgian. So these are some of our amazing saints that we had, and I think that's where we'll stop because I know Sister is right here and I don't want to get into her time, but I did leave a little reading assignment if you want to learn a little bit more about the history of the Crusades. Thomas Madden, that's a really great article to read there. So take that with you if you'd like. And thank you all for your time and attention.